and Dr. Ovamir Anjum, please, and Dr. Dalia Fahmy and Dr. Emad Shahin for the second session, and Dr. Ismail.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming again for this great conference. Actually, it was obviously very timely, given the fact that yesterday evening's news with the Turkey and the US government's decisions to actually ban the visa applications of the both sides. So probably some of our colleagues from the United States would not be able to come actually if they decide to come today. So unfortunately, things are getting even worse. I hope it will not continue like this, of course, but given the fact that we have a different kind of governance in the United States, we cannot be never sure actually. So actually, unfortunately, we are running out of time a bit. We are late, so I won't keep this introduction long. So that's why I will quickly go to our speakers. First, Dr. Ovamir Anjum will make his speech from University of Toledo. Please.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Can I have the PowerPoint here? Thank you. And do I have the clicker? How does it work? How do I move this forward? I don't see the clicker. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to talk about constructions of legitimacy in Islamic political tradition, given that we have even more abbreviated time than originally anticipated. I'm going to jump right into it. What I'm going to do is present some of the classical arguments for how political authority was constructed in Islamic tradition, particularly Kalam tradition, Usuli tradition, both the Athari side, the traditionalists, and Ahl al-Kalam, and I'm going to focus only on the Sunni tradition. We'll making comparative comments. And then I will look at derive a list of factors or elements that were considered implicitly or explicitly the foundations of legitimacy, political legitimacy, and then make some comments about how to negotiate these competing elements of legitimacy. So let me begin with how Islamic political legitimacy is classically defined as khilafa or imama, and these are some of the classical definitions of what constitutes al-khilafa, which means successorship, that is succeeding the role of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in leading the ummah, leading the community. At-Taftazani defines khilafa as riyasat amma fi amr ad-din wa ad-dunya khilafatan an al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it is riyasa amma, leadership of the generality. Amma here, the emphasis is on everyone, and this becomes important later as we talk about it. Fi amr ad-din wa ad-dunya, again another element. Khilafatan an al-Nabi. Al-Mawardi defines al-imama as mawdu'a لخلافة النبوة في حراسة الدين وسياسة الدنيا. It's a classic and much repeated definition that al-imama has been placed or created in order to succeed the Prophet in safeguarding the religion and administering the affairs of this world. In some versions of Al-Mawardi's Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniya, it ends with siyasat al-dunya bihi, that is administering the world by means of religious norms. And then Ibn Khaldun has a similar definition. You will notice that al-khilafa and imama are used interchangeably in classical literature. Generally, the historians tended to use the khilafa, the theologians tended to use imama, but on the whole, they have been interchangeable. It's the same office, the office that represents the Prophet, that continues, if you will, the Prophet's job of safeguarding and guiding the ummah. Moving on to some of the generally agreed on conditions for imama, Abu Ya'la al-Farra writes, أهل الإمامة فيعتبر فيهم أربع شروط. There are 4 conditions. One, that he must be a Qurayshi, and second, he must be has sufficient credentials to be a qadi, that is a judge, and among them the conditions of freedom and maturity and intellect and knowledge and probity. The third, that he must have capacity of leadership. Here, both capacity of leadership and ability to lead, both in war, in administration, siyasa, and iqamatul hudud, enactment of prescribed punishments. And fourth, must be able to defend, and the defense of the ummah. And the fourth, that he must be among the highest or the superior, most superior in religion and knowledge, that is in piety and knowledge. All of these conditions are ideals, and then various conditions or qualifications or concessions are given. For example, one major distinctive Sunni concession has been that the imam does not need to be al-afdal, he could be al-mafdul. It doesn't need to be the most superior in religion, the most pious person, because we can never figure it out, but could be somebody who is less than most pious. So these are the definitions, and what I'm trying to bring out here is the central considerations which tell us what was considered central to this construction of legitimacy. The evidence of obligation, how it was considered, how is the religious obligation constructed? In Sunnis, it is known by hadith reports, by interpretation of the Quran, but it's not explicit in the Quran. And so hadith reports, khabar and ijma' of the companions. There is a slight difference among the Sunnis between Ahl al-Kalam and Ahl al-Athar. So Ahl al-Kalam and Ahl al-Athar both are interested in establishing this as a qat'i or definitive obligation and not a dhanni obligation. As many of you, those who are familiar with Kalam and Usul, know that a practical obligation in fiqh only needs dhanni or conjectural evidence. It doesn't need qat'i evidence, but this was particularly important. This khilafah or imamah is considered an art, if you will, arch obligation, and both sides of the Sunni schools, Ahl al-Athar and Ahl al-Kalam, are interested in providing a definitive evidence for it, which doesn't accept the dhanni or possible refutation. Ahl al-Kalam do that by emphasizing ijma' sahaba, whereas Ahl al-Athar do that by providing hadith or hadith reports that are considered ahad, and they're singularly reported, not multiply reported, but nonetheless, for Ahl al-Hadith, this was sufficient to establish definitive obligation. The important part, the difference between Shia and Sunni, is that for the Sunnis, it is an obligation, but not part of the creed. So it's part of a practical obligation, but not creed, which meant that one could be a Muslim without it. Whereas for the Shia, it was the essence of religion, part of the creed, and one must know the Imam of the time, if only in heart. this excerpt from Ibn Taymiyyah shows another distinction, which is how this notion of khilafah was separated from just any kind of leadership, especially mulk. In the Near Eastern societies, before Islam, in fact, for several centuries, and in the region around, the words that were used to refer to political power were either sultan or malik. This was in Arabic, also in various dialects of Arabic. The sultan or malik is a traditional sort of term that is used to refer to the ruler. But Muslims, interestingly, avoid that terminology. The Quran comes out, in fact, critical of this mulk or malik as titles. And so Muslims make this distinction and say that Muslim ruler is not a malik but a khalifa or amir. And the distinction was that mulk or malik was considered worldly government in which the ruler owns the people and their wealth. And the emphasis is on the construction of this power of a malik is power and arbitrary will. A malik is somebody who owns people and acts according to his will, whereas an imam and khalifa in Muslim tradition is considered, he's otherworldly, bound by the prophetic model, legitimated by divine law, and on the basis of bay'ah or contracts from the ummah. So Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, says, well, the question people ask, is mulk jaiz, is it legitimate in our ummah or not? And he says, فنحتج بأنه ليس بجائز في الأصل, that it is, mulk is not permissible in our tradition in Islam. بل الواجب خلافة النبوة لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم عليكم بسنتي وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين من بعدي. And so he argues that khilafah and khilafat al-nubuwah, succeeding the prophet in the characteristics of the prophet, of prophethood, is an obligation for this ummah. Okay, and then he gives dalil based on hadith, several hadith reports. Another distinction between Amir and Sultan, often people do not make. Amir, Sultan on the one hand, and the Imam. The word Imam is used for the supreme, if you will, authority, the Khalifa or the Imam, whereas Amir and Sultan were used for territorial and limited rulers. So Al-Juwayni, for example, in Al-Ghiyathi writes about when discussing the issue of whether there can be more than one Imams at a time, he says, of course they can't. This doesn't make sense. The only possibility is if some part of the Muslim world is cut off by an enemy territory or by an ocean or something, and its inhabitants are still obliged to choose a ruler and uphold the law. That is, these are territorially limited territory, state doesn't include all the Muslims. But the ruler is not to be called an imam, doesn't hold the office of the imam, and the obligation of the imamah is not considered fulfilled. Such a person or ruler is to be called an amir, and this is supposed to be a temporary situation. Al-Ghazali makes perhaps the strongest argument for the arch obligation of the caliphate, saying, look, there are people who say that the Khalifa is not effective in our time anymore. So we're moving fast through time, and by the time Al-Ghazali, the Abbasids are symbolic rulers, but not in actual power. And he says, so what do you want us to do? Do you want all the qadis, all the rulings to come to a halt because we do not have an imam? So the assumption that he's making, and he explicitly defends it elsewhere, that without an imam, all legitimate Islamic life comes to an end. This is the strongest claim on behalf of the caliphate made in Islamic tradition, that others say that it's simply an obligation, but don't go far as far as saying that all of our contracts and all of our Islamic life comes to, or legitimate life comes to an end without a caliph. But nonetheless, this is Al-Ghazali, right? This is somebody who sort of sums up the classical tradition, not a marginal figure. So what I'll go and looking through some of these definitions, I will classify or schematize the definitions of legitimacy that are given. So there is a formal legitimacy, which is the proper ideal, the form, proper form including requisite qualities in the ruler, as well as the mechanism of succession, of accession to power. So for instance, shura and bay'ah, and the requirement that the ruler be a probative Muslim and so on. These are considered formal requirements or formal type of legitimacy. Then there are what I would argue are what I'll call substantive elements of legitimacy, meaning relating to how one governed. So does the ruler uphold religion in fact, rather than say just in theory or in claims, justice and upholding of divine law and so on? These are considered related to the substance of rule, and some ulama prefer substantive considerations over formal ones. And then pragmatic definition or pragmatic form of legitimacy, which is relating to practical considerations, such as if a usurper, somebody who takes power even by an informal process, by circumventing bay'ah and so on, but overpowers others, but then can protect religion, defeat foreign invaders, keep peace and order, whereas the formal elected ruler cannot. Sunnis go for the pragmatic option. And this, of course, happens, the famous case of that is the Seljuks, who are able in famous battle against the Byzantines in 1071, the Battle of Manzikert. They have great victory. The Byzantine threat is neutralized. And so the ulama at this point argue that the Seljuks, in fact, are legitimate rulers. This is also the time when Al-Juwayni writes in defense of the Seljuks, essentially arguing that the pragmatic considerations, that even if somebody takes power by non-formal means, but they defend Muslims, and that pragmatic, that they have a kind of legitimacy. Now, throughout Islamic history until early 20th century, at least in the formal orthodox discourse in law and theology, there is no one that says that pragmatic legitimacy can fully replace formal legitimacy, meaning you always needed an imam, and if you don't have an imam, a khalifa, you lived in hope that one day you will have one. So in other words, you learn to live in the living room, in the waiting room, understanding, right, in the same way that Shia learned to live without the Imam. Sunnis have a small version of that by learning, never giving up the ideal, learning that, yes, you'll never have perfect life here and now. This changes, obviously, in the modern period where people do not have the patience to wait for another 1,000 years. Now I will identify elements of legitimacy. Some of the ones that I've mentioned before, but I'm going to more clearly demarcate them. Religion and upholding the divine law. There was no debate about those two elements. But then the other four, unity, that is the keeping the ummah together. This was actually a big argument that the Umayyads made against their opponents. So we are providing you unity, whereas our opponents who want shura or who want some other kind of pietistic government, they only give you civil war. So unity has been often, sometimes it's been pitted against shura or against proper mechanism, but you could also argue that between the Wahhabis and the Ottomans, this was an argument. Ottomans would represent the unity of the Ummah, where the Wahhabis are raising the stakes by saying, well, we are defending the Aqidah, defending religion itself. Different elements of legitimacy that are often pitted against each other. Then you have power, which is simply the ability to defend and the ability to uphold law domestically. This consideration, obviously we saw shawka, power pitted against the formal process of election in Egypt recently between Morsi and Sisi, where one side essentially argued that you may be formally elected, but you don't control power, you don't have the shawka. So this is if you will, Islamic tradition has dealt with this question for quite some time, and I will come back to the negotiation of these elements. And then the formal element of consultation and contract, consultation being shura and contract being bay'ah. Often, of course, in the modern sense, we look back in history and we emphasize shura, but shura was simply a mechanism to identify the ruler, the potential ruler, but contract, bay'ah, was considered the, if you will, the real final step that made you a ruler. But this formal process, first election and then contract, was something that always remained in the books as necessary, even though, as I will show, that in the Mamluk period, the ulama begin to increasingly go for power or shawka in favor of any formal processes. Finally, justice and lineage. Justice is something that for early Muslims before early Muslim tradition, classical tradition, before the Mamluk period, it actually remains quite important, to the point, and this is true not only for the Shia, for whom it remains an active, and for the Khawarij, for both of those sects, this remains quite important and central, but even for the Sunnis before the Mamluk period, actually justice is quite important. So if you read Ahl al-Kalam, treatises written on this subject before the Mamluk period, you find justice as a necessary requirement. So Al-Juwayni, for example, no lesser figure than Al-Juwayni, argues that if there is more injustice than justice, and the ruler is supporting forces that bring injustice and chaos and oppression of the weak and so on, then revolt or rebellion is preferred over silence. But this is obviously a famous split among the Sunnis on this issue, which is justice, should all kind of injustice be tolerated so long as the ruler is Muslim, right? So those two positions remain competing. But in the Mamluk period, and I will argue especially now in this neo-traditionalist innovation of Islamic tradition, power remains the only determinant. Right. Now, a caution before I move forward. It is often understood that the ulama, and these are comments made both in the Orientalist literature but also in Islamist literature, that the ulama were either simplistic idealists or mindless justifiers of whoever came to power. This was not the case, and I've tried to show that through some of this history that this was not the case. In fact, there were various tendencies. Some were more idealistic and others were more pragmatic or realists. And as it developed in time, the non-negotiables, religion, law, and often unity, became distinguished from negotiables, such as Qurayshi lineage and independent ijtihad and so on. Some issues remain disputed, which is, does the imam lose his office due to personal sinfulness? Shia argued, yes. Public sinfulness, injustice, and oppression, Juwayni argued, yes. Temporary loss of independence and freedom, Mawardi argued that we should still allow the imamate to continue. Loss of all coercive power while maintaining symbolic power, Al-Ghazali argued that even in such cases, the imamate should continue. So you have a wide range of debates on issues like this. Finally, the subject matter of Islamic political theory, especially in the post-formative period, has been how to prioritize various grounds for legitimacy. Now, the negotiable parts have been unity, power, formal process, and justice. Which of these elements trumps others? And what I argue is that there is no single way in which these issues can be once and for all, in all times and places, resolved, but rather what I propose is a distinct discipline of Islamic political thought with elements of philosophy, theory, and modeling, and fiqh, which provides practical norms, And the task of this discipline would be to work the various elements of these legitimacy into one coherent system. And these will be inevitably multiplicity of systems. And the job of the field will be to create a common language of discourse to compare and evaluate these competing systems. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
We thank Ovamir for his presentation, insightful one. So now I keep the floor for Dalia from Long Island University.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So I'll confess and be very open that I'm not an Islamic studies scholar, I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to ask everyone to reorient the way we're going to talk about this theme. When we think about this term ummah, especially in the way it was defined last night, how do we use it to address questions like the international state system or even foreign policy? What accounts for variance along in what is understood by the ummah? But by isolating post-Arab Spring states, what I hope to do today is look at three categories of states that emerge. The stable or stabilizing, like Tunisia, those in turmoil, like Syria and Yemen, and those on the brink, like Egypt. And by looking at a set of factors, I call them endogenous and exogenous, although I know those are not the best capture terms for them. If we look at the endogenous factors, economic development, political and social pluralism, before the Arab Spring, and a certain set of exogenous factors, like the role of US foreign policy since the Iranian Revolution, the Cold War, the subsequent support for autocratic regimes, for the maintenance of the international status quo, we can begin to better pose certain questions that might highlight some of the challenges that face and continue to face this notion of the Muslim world or Ummah in general, and these post-Arab Spring states in particular. Now, between 2011 and 2015, 6 Arab presidents in Egypt, Yemen, Tunisia, and Libya were forced out of office either by mass protest or military coups. Governments in almost every Arab country have been reestablished and reorganized, some even formulating new electoral systems and inaugurating new prime ministers. And in countries such as Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen and Syria and Sudan and Jordan and Morocco have introduced new constitutions and major legislative amendments. Changes in the Arab world, complemented with promises of representative and democratically elected governments, created a wave of newly found anti-authoritarian public sentiments. The emerging generation of youth demanding a free and democratic Middle East and North Africa took the world by surprise, unleashing a search for the causal factors underlying this phenomenon. Now, there are no shortage of explanations. Some ascribe these revolts to the rapid growth of social media in the region, which channeled grievances into collective action. Others point to the emergence of civil society that provided new norms and organizational impetus to rebel. Others explain them by referencing this youth bulge and the widespread youth unemployment, which fueled dissatisfaction behind the uprisings. Liberal economists contend that the combination of growing inequality, a receding state, the rising level of education, the production of this combination of grievances and aspirations sufficient to propel revolutionary challenges. And some Marxist interpretations, by contrast, point to the location of the Arab states in the world of the capitalist system and the critical production of that in the revolt. Now, each of these arguments definitely holds some explanatory power, but they also allow for some important questions to not come to the forefront around these variations in the cases that I want to highlight. But more critically for me is the shock that enveloped most political scientists in the West. How did we miss it? But the real questions emerge of not what was missed, but not what was not being questioned or even studied. And if we want to theorize the theories that fail to theorize, often we point to this historically anomalous region, this illiberal nature of many authoritarian post-Cold War countries that forced a renewed debate within the liberal discourse. Among the arguments advanced in the literature is this idea of Middle Eastern exceptionalism. Theoretical justification of this view was provided by the Western Orientalist scholars, but many post-colonial scholars added to this as well. While Orientals pointed to the dominant anti-liberal traits of Muslim countries, post-colonial authors also blamed imperialism and colonial centers for backing authoritarian regimes with the aim of extracting resources and maintaining economic subjugation. Cultural explanations associated religious and cultural practice with the consolidation of authoritarianism, and thus obstructed the potential for the attainment of individual liberty and limited government, and post-colonial economic exceptionalism created within the Arab world a list of permanent states that caused a major rift between the elite and society, giving the elite unchecked reign for power over society. Now, relevant to this discourse is security exceptionalism, which correlates coercive security apparatus with the strategic significance of these Arab states, whose stability requirements are prioritized, those in opposition to attainment of liberty. Now, Arab autocratic states have justified the rule as international guarantors of stability against extremism and chaos. Their geopolitical significance is such, and the lack of democracy development prerequisites has undermined the ability of mass mobilization efforts to establish the accountable governments. The 2005 Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, or the 2009 Green Movement in Iran, or the Arab Spring challenged this idea of exceptionalism and long-term held assumptions. The snowballing collapse of some of these autocratic regimes brought to power popularly elected governments in Egypt and in Tunisia, for example. And it appeared for a while that this fourth wave we've all been waiting for might be here. Yet the Arab protest movement failed to blossom into an Arab Spring, or a democratic spring. Monarchies appeared resilient and exceptionally persistent. Armed struggles and violent clashes in Syria and Iraq and Libya and Sudan and Bahrain demonstrated that regimes were far from willing to concede any power. Domestic struggles in the most affected Arab Spring states appeared to have plunged societies into states on the brink. In post-revolutionary Egypt, an elected president was overthrown by the military, signaling a reverse, and violent extremism began to mushroom in the region, and ethno-sectarian communitarianism also further divided groups. Now, the pattern and dynamic change of the Middle East and North Africa doesn't appear to be evolving along a linear trajectory, nor are its outcomes indicative of a single theory of change. Therefore, formulating a comprehensive understanding of the change in the MENA region can best be accomplished by understanding the uniqueness of each country's challenges. And an important aspect of this Arab Spring is the fact that the most radical upheavals have taken place in autocratic states that have long rested on two factors. One set endogenous, such as this patrimonial rule, states that are characterized by centralized management in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and Syria and Yemen. Then the qualification of that sets the Arab Spring states apart is that also critical to the understanding is the timing of these political transformations, namely these exogenous factors that come at a time when the world has reached an unprecedented level of political, cultural, and economic globalization, a factor that came to challenge nationalist ideologies, but also corresponding political economies. Thus, an assessment of the current status and the change that we need to understand requires an in-depth contextual analysis that takes into consideration economic, social, and political environments and the geopolitical forces at play. Now, chief among the drivers is at this level of the economy. Changes that are unprecedented and overwhelming the global economic forces have challenged the idea of the nation state and have reconfigured prerequisites for their existence. For example, closed and centralized economies were seriously challenged by global economic integration. Now, this largely can be driven by the economic agendas of, for example, the Washington Consensus, or the World Bank, or the IMF, or the WTO, or the G8 World Summits. Now, global economic outlooks have in effect stripped many nation states of their ability to enforce barriers against global trade and commerce in favor of free cross-border exchange of capital, and labor. The outcome in the MENA region has been a direct challenge to the long-established closed economies of centralized autocracies. The accompanying privatization of the public sector inspired large-scale corruption, which, ultimately led to the undermining of the ruling state's accountability and credibility toward their own societies. Simultaneously, global deregulation has exposed national economies to vicious global competition. The fact that these states were economically based on semi-formal sectors deepened that crisis, leading to dramatically sectoral reshuffling that actually favored things like real estate and urban services and tourism and communication and technology that marginalizes the large majority of society. If we think about the tension that is highlighted in the one individual of Mohamed Bouazizi, a young Tunisian who became the tragic symbol of the Arab Spring, he set himself on fire in protest against the taking of his pushcart that was confiscated. He was mocked and humiliated. A 27-year-old street vendor who was making about $200 a month to provide for his family and his sister's college tuition. The story of Bouazizi enrages the large, educated, and unemployed and underemployed youth throughout much of the Middle East and North America, because it was those economic conditions that led to that moment. At the societal level, nationalism, which had provided an ideological superstructure sufficient to justify and legitimize some kind of autocratic rule, had begun to become deconstructed by globalization. And if we think about the direct impacts of communication and innovations, it leads to a proliferation of feelings that much of society is actually deprived. Differential grievances have inspired protests and undermined monolithic national identity. In terms of politics, the growing legitimacy deficit can be observed within the ruling institutions. National security, traditionally managed along domestic territorial boundaries, had been transnational and regional in context. Transnational arms groups, regional rivalries, international challenges, counterterrorism, shifting global polarities have all exerted mounting political challenges for the state. And instead of adapting, ultimately we saw where that loyalties became much more local. In some, economic, social, and the political context fundamentally changed. In the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, the two cases we study most, we see that various aspects of contemporary political transition expose prospective regional challenges. Now, what I've aimed to do really quickly is really think about the challenge and raising questions about the theoretical approaches that we've been using to understand these historical moments. And while walking through each of these cases requires looking at failing and stabilizing states through these endogenous and exogenous factors, and looking at each one is outside the scope of my time, what I want to raise is a new set of questions informed by the concept of ummah that we discussed last night. Now, questions cannot be posed without thinking about how are we going to clarify our terms. And in this regard, what comprises that thing called ummah? Who belongs to it? And on what principles is it formed? The Arab Spring was a signal towards a new world order. If we really think about it, it was a signal towards a new world order, a new definition of state, a new definition of identity, a new definition of status quo, both internally but also externally. And in that change or new status, there would emerge what we call in politics a system of winners and losers. Now, if the winners were going to be the average citizens, the Bouazizis of the world, or the average insan, as was referred to last night, who would have to lose? Hegemony, states, multinational corporation, globalization of the capital, or the flow of capital but not the flow of individuals. These tensions fundamentally have to be questioned. What would a new world order look like that takes the lived experience of individuals seriously? At the level of nation states, taking the ummah seriously is problematic. How would we define the national interest? Is national interest reconcilable with human interest, or humanity, or human rights? In international relations paradigms of realism and liberalism, the national interest always trumps everything else. It trumps human interest, it trumps human security, and it trumps human rights. It was not too long ago that our Secretary of State said about Rwanda, "We have no strategic interest in Rwanda." But what is the concept of ummah forcing us to rethink? Does it actually take into account notions of citizenship and the state and who belongs? Does this concept of ummah, if it's a system of values, can these values become foreign policy? Can they redefine a national interest to reflect human interest? If we want to take what some scholars have called a maqasid al-sharia approach to even things like foreign policy, where there's an ethical system of principles, then the concept of ummah can't be just an affinity to helping external problems be alleviated temporarily, but it has to actually reflect on internal domestic interests of the lived experience of everyone within the country, but also everyone without the country or outside the country. Which populations are going to matter most? How can we not fall into conceptual slippage where the members of the ummah are a pluralistic society of the elite? In the concept of the ummah, where are the geographic borders? Is it identity borders? Is it this imagined community of belonging? Is it for Muslims only or Muslim majority countries? Who claims belonging? Is it individuals, or is this category divinely assigned to all of humanity? Now, another attention is that post-war international system. The current status quo of primary world actors. If we take the status quo international system, then is this able to apply a universally applicable concept of ummah? We arrive at the great tension of the state cannot reconcile national interest with human interest and the entirety of humanity if we continue to use the same model of the national interest. And while yes, as mentioned last night, we do talk about the 3 levels of analysis in international relations, states are not the primary actors. What about multinational corporations? What about, for example, the behavior of companies like Shell in Nigeria, or ExxonMobil throughout the world, or Coca-Cola? What about the fundamental ways with which we look at capital flow but resist human flow? What does it mean to tell an individual, I want your money, but I don't want you? That's what globalization has come to mean in many ways. And to my final point, why post-Arab Spring states? Why am I using this as the lens? The wave that swept through the Middle East and North Africa, shocking the world in its intensity and revolutionary potential, highlighted the power of the human condition. It really was a test of how we're going to rethink the ummah as a movement, as a voice, whose conditions were not met, from dignity to survival to belonging, and to not just individuals but to all of humanity. Post-Arab Spring states have a lot to teach us about the variables, both endogenous and exogenous, that affect the lived experience of individuals and the world we see today. Ultimately, the cries of the people were heard, but the armies and the international status quo's interests had the last word so far. Armies of these states whose national interest was the maintenance of internal status quo and the international system with a world order that is dependent on that status quo could not allow this movement to continue. And if we actually take a step forward, I was actually thinking about this last night, if we think about this moment that happened, not during the Arab Spring, but during the first democratically elected president in Egypt, when he referred to Labbaik ya Surya, what did that mean? And the other moment I remember is a coup happened in 2013. What happened in 2014 in Gaza? Would that have happened if the international order was moving in a different direction? And so we have to ask ourselves, yes, there were internal factors that led to the failure of the Arab Spring, internal factors that led to its coming, but also external factors that also led to this was going to threaten the international status quo. And so if we're going to rethink how we reconcile international relations, foreign policy, the national interest and human interest, or this concept of the ummah, then we're going to have to ask ourselves, if individuals or humans or humanity or everyone's going to win, then who's going to lose? Thank you.
We thank Dalia for her presentation. And now Professor Emad Shahin from Hamid bin Khalifa University. Hamad. Yes, please. Yes. It's open now.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, everyone. It's always good, actually, to be with friends and colleagues and have the opportunity to share ideas and views about important topics like what we're discussing today, the Ummah and legitimacy and the way forward. Before I start my presentation, I would really like to acknowledge the presence of 3 of our students from the College of Islamic Studies who took the initiative on their own to come and attend this conference at their own time, own expense. And as Dean, I will try to redress this, inshallah, when I come back in reward for your initiative. Yes, okay. So thank you so much for being here. I was asked originally to address the issue of developing a model for political legitimacy for contemporary Muslim societies. And I have to tell you, in the title of the presentation, I went back and forth with Dr. Sami about this title, and then when the title in the brochure came as main features for political legitimacy, actually it gave me a sigh of relief, because this is a less daunting and more humbling assignment and task than just trying to come up with an ideal model or a paradigm for political legitimacy for contemporary Muslim societies. This idea of one size fits all. Now, how to move forward? How to move forward? What are the main features? Because that's actually the essence of the lecture. I skipped, by the way, a huge part. One, of course, is, unfortunately, and I'm talking here in particular, Arab politics has turned into a very primitive state of nature politics, if you wish. And I'm sorry to say that. But we have delved or plunged into that stage. So usually when things get complicated, what we do? Go back to the basics. So the basics is what? Nation building, state building. That's what we need to move forward. This is exactly the essence of what we discuss. Nation building, what does, in politics, nation building translates what? To the issue of ummah and identity and political community and the boundaries of the system. That's what we teach to our students, nation building. And then state building. How can we build the state? This is too idealistic. I have to admit, very idealistic. And how can you do it in Yemen now and Syria after all this blood and bloodshed? How can you do this? Too idealistic. So that's why the theoretical framework, the paradigm is excellent up in planet Mars. When it comes to planet Earth, we look at or try to adopt a functional approach to the state and the legitimacy it should garner in order to generate consent. Functions, simple functions. However, there was talk about the old order and new order, but so before I go that, I have to admit that what I'm going to propose also it will need really a miracle to be implementable, given this state. But what is needed, if we accept this argument that we are going through a collapse of an old order to the establishment of a new order, and this, or the feature of that new order, إعادة تشكيل المنطقة, the reshaping of the Middle East, is being done by the Bernard Lewis and this and that in Washington or God knows where. We have to do it by ourselves. So from this platform, I'm really calling for an immediate conference of 500, 1,000 intellectuals from the Muslim world, highly specialized, highly serious, to look into how to develop a vision for the future of this new order, new Arab and new Islamic order. Short of this, there is no way you can avoid this. We are in 1916, all these, like Versailles, San Remo, Sykes-Picot, all this, that's where we are now. And that was done, if you remember, with a formula and with a sponsor. The formula was the nation-state formula, 1916-19, and the sponsor was the mandate system. Now we have to do it on our own. Otherwise, we'll turn into really, as Charles Glass said before, tribes with flags, sects with flags, and that's it. No countries, nothing, no nation states, anyway. So you look at the functional issue, and then the features, the main features for the formula should, at least in my view, and I can be wrong, 100% wrong, but at least it should contain 6 features or 6 elements. And that I will conclude with that. One is integration and inclusion. A legitimate state should perform the function of integration and inclusion. Any state that's going to emerge, not a Kurdistan, that has to be immediately and readily rejected because it's a sectarian one. Period. Whether they have right, Mazlumin, Mish Mazlumin, you are a sectarian person. That's it. It's not acceptable. You are not allowing for this integration and inclusion inside. Diffusion of power, distribution of power and diffusion of power, enabling society, representation, transfer of power, and social justice, adala, that was talked about yesterday. These are the main features and these elements. How this formula, and also just to conclude with this, can be achieved within an Islamic state, within a democratic state, or any modern framework of a state, as long as it achieves its objective. I will conclude with this, saying that we, again, it's not taking a side or preferring one type of faith over another, but إن الله ينصر الدولة العادلة حتى ولو كانت كافرة. That's in the jury, that God grants victory to a just state, even if it is a disbelieving state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shahin, for his provocative presentation. So actually now, inshallah, we can get some questions from the audience. Probably I would like to start from the students, if there are any. Then we can continue to guest professors. Yes, any questions? A younger? Jamal Shayal is the youngest so far. If there is not, okay, please.
So, my question is more to Dr. Emad. I know you forfeited your right to answer, but if you don't mind. And maybe Dr. Dalia can comment on this. This is with regards to looking at things through the Arab Spring states, or the prism of what happened in 2011. And I know maybe there's a bit of contradiction here, but I think it's important to try and clarify something. You were mentioning
paradigm that can be suitable in terms of political legitimacy for everyone and so on. I think this goes beyond my knowledge, my expertise, and maybe beyond anyone's expertise. I will divide my presentation to 3 parts. I will address 3 parts. One, of course, giving the discussion that went back and forth to define what we mean exactly, or what I mean by legitimacy within the context of my presentation. The second part will be to try to analyze the attempts of very prominent contemporary Muslim thinkers actually to develop a paradigm for political legitimacy for Muslim society. There is a very kind of well-known now phrase or framework that's called النسق القياسي للدولة الشرعية. Literally, it is translated as the ideal type or framework for a legitimate state, or a paradigm for a legitimate state. And of course, here the legitimate state is an Islamic state. So I will try to discuss this, the issue of paradigm and whether we can come up with this or not. And finally, I will try to examine the concept of legitimacy within the current situation of the Arab uprisings and the failing nation-state system that we have been witnessing nowadays. Now, based on what we have heard so far, I mean the presentations yesterday and today, I think one has to raise a number of questions. One is it possible to examine the issue of political legitimacy in isolation of traditional modalities that Ovamir, for example, addressed, and Muslim historical experiences? We have seen how the juridical or jurisprudential justifications for legitimacy, for politics, for the Khilafah and so on evolves and develop depending on the reality and just to catch up with the reality, to justify reality and so on. This is one question. The second question is, can we benchmark political legitimacy in accordance to a Muslim particularity without falling into Islamic exceptionalism? That we generate this and fall into this trap. That for us, because we are special, we are unique, our legitimacy is Sharia-based, and the function of the caliph or the head or the imam of the state is very unique, therefore we can devise some kind of exceptionalism when we talk of legitimacy. As a political scientist, my professional integrity cannot allow this, because we know there are requirements for these concepts, and there are requisites that have also to be fulfilled in addition to any ideological framing or icing on the cake, as they say, that we might come up with. The third is there one modality for political legitimacy? Legal, political, traditional, performance, merit, repression. Is there one modality, or religious? As I will discuss right now. Now, can we develop certain features for political legitimacy within the concept of the nation state, the failing nation state system, and the all-powerful media and repression machine that can easily engender false consciousness and forge consent? So with this kind of media and machine and brainwashing and so on, we can easily generate consent for those who are ruling and so on. And I think Ovamir and Dr. Dalia also, they referred to what happened in Egypt in the coup and so on. And even now, if you run a survey, I think the results will be shocking in terms of people's consent. Now, finally, can we develop new features for political legitimacy in light of the massive popular uprisings and the development of people power, the exercise of people power, vis-a-vis regimes that assume power through due process and legality and juridical legitimacy? I think we have seen this as well. The majority, from our own perspective, can be wrong, and they can choose the wrong guys. And they can give consent and legitimacy to repressive regimes and to wrong guys. How can we deal with this? And if within the paradigm and so on of legitimacy, how can we apply such paradigms to a very particular and very kind of, I don't want to take sides, but like special reality, distorted, special, whatever you call it. So this is what I will do. But first, what do I mean, or how can I use, or the way I use legitimacy in this context? For me, political legitimacy, and for other theorists, most theorists, is essentially a matter of perception. It's a matter of perception of who has the right to rule. If you would like to place it within Islamic context, liman al-hukm. Remember this question? Liman al-hukm. Who rules? Who has the right to rule? That has been as old as the beginning of Islamic caliphate and political descent in Islam and so on. So it rests on the consent and acceptance of the people, political and social constituencies, not constituency, not ummah, constituencies of the political regime or the administration or leaders to rule over them. This is how I use legitimacy, and that's how I understand. This could be questioned, definitely. But this is, for me, a neutral definition of, it's a matter of perception, matter of acceptance, consent of people, of your right to rule over me. It's very simple, very simple. Now, what complicates this concept? Actually, the legalists, the theorists, the theologians, the political scientists that come later on and put this icing on the cake, put some kind of ideological, doctrinal, theological justifications, grounding for the legitimacy in order to make it readily accepted. So you generate consent by divine rule. You generate consent by performance, by qualifications, by anything, by religion, by hirasatul deen, by khilafatul nubuwwah, This is all generating consent. Aside, I'm really glad that Umair, for example, talked about the 3 types, the ideal or formal, and then the performance or I think that you called it the pragmatic, and then the last one, no, before the pragmatic, the practical, substantive, and then the pragmatic. It's very important, but in most cases, this distinction is not made very clear. People are there in power, and then they have to stay in power until you see some kind of change happening to their rule. So this is the way. Now, to summarize, for me at least, or within this context, because it's very important, because we will build on the current attempts to create a paradigm. So, legitimacy is dynamic and not static concept. يزيد وينقص, like belief. It rests with the people, not with something else outside the community of the people themselves, the citizenry. It's linked to specific functions and processes that are organized by clear and agreed upon ground rules, legal frameworks. Why I'm saying this? Because as you will see, the nasakh al-qiyasi, it doesn't pay much attention to the legal framework. It's not that important. What's that important is the Sharia-based consent and the commitment to the Sharia and the implementation of the Hakimiyya. That's what's the most important thing. If that's fulfilled, the rest could be tolerated. Here what I'm saying is, no, legitimacy has components. These are some of the components. It is dynamic, it rests with the people, it links to specific functions, processes, and legal frameworks that organize the relationship between the state and the rest. It's very simple. And then some emphasize the doctrinal, ideological, or conceptual framework of reference that each system should uphold. What we are talking about here, if you are talking, for example, about democratic system, so the framework of reference for that democratic system is what? Liberalism. If you are talking about a communist, it's socialism or communism. And the same thing, this is what Dr. Taha Badawi calls al-marji'iyya al-ulya lid-dawla, the supreme frame of reference for any state, for any system. It could be democratic, liberal, it could be socialist, and it could be Islamic. I'm not arguing against this because I don't want to get into this kind of debate now, enough blood and enough conflict. But what I'm questioning is the connection between this marja'iyya, this legal framework, and what entails, or the entitlement it automatically gives, or the jurists would like to give to those who rule. That's what I'm questioning. There are 2 separate things, totally 2 separate things. All right, now, so I don't look at legitimacy from an ideological perspective. I'm a functional structuralist, so I don't look at it from an ideological perspective or a comprehensive, or see it as a comprehensive system or concept that rests with the state. I don't see it as such. Now, the contemporary Muslim thinkers. There are a few prominent, very prominent, and very influential Muslim thinkers, I will mention their names now, that have a great influence, and I think now they have led a school of thought. And again, I'm not trying to criticize what they are doing, or because most of them are our mentors and really have their high credentials and so on, but I'm trying just to see if we can, after this accumulation, what they have done, we can take it a step further. That's all what I'm trying to do. Develop it a step further. So, for example, there is a whole school that are trying to search for some kind of a coherent framework for political legitimacy for a legitimate Islamic state. النسق القياسي للدولة الإسلامية. Of course, the leader of this school is Dr. Muna Abu al-Fadl, Allah yarhamha. Dr. Saif Abdel Fattah, also Dr. Amani Saleh did a wonderful PhD dissertation on النسق السياسي, the ideal type or the paradigm, and the caliphate and so on, and they did a great job in terms of how can we say, updating, linking, let's call it linking the traditional frameworks with contemporary or possible contemporary political structures that we can develop and devise. Now, to summarize this framework, they look, or nasakh al-qiyasi, the paradigm, they look at this paradigm as consisting of 6 or 7 elements. Very quickly, because I don't want to run. Can you just tell me 5 minutes before my time runs up so I can? Right. So one is, within this nasakh al-siyasi, the legitimacy or the nature of legitimacy of the Islamic State is religious. It's diniyya. meaning it's not primarily diniya, but it is in nature, reason that is dini, because there is a sharia involved. So it is Islamic, it is religious, and so on. The second thing, it's very comprehensive. So you cannot say, for example, legal legitimacy and procedural legitimacy or whatever, but it has to be all in one, that it covers the political, the legal, and is manifested in ethical, social, legal, and political implications that determine the behavior and the relationship between the state and the ummah in that case. Usually the term that they use is ummah, which again, in that particular case, it has to be qualified. I think, based on the discussion we had yesterday, it has to be qualified. Ummahs, what constitutes an ummah, outside, inside? Is it just an ummah, or we can use something else? I will, as I will mention right now. Then the third, the state is the embodiment of political legitimacy. Yani, with all respect, what Umair mentioned just in his presentation, if you look, it always focuses on what? The state, the Amir, the ruler, the Imam, the Caliph, and then the Ummah is just enabler, if you wish. قابلة كده. يعني بتولد الإمام. يعني like a what do you call it? Midwife. It's a midwife. It's like a midwife. The Ummah is a midwife for the Imam. Then it affects the establishment of the Ummah. The political legitimacy affects the establishment of the Ummah, because within that paradigm there is something called Ummah Shar'iyya, a legitimate Ummah as opposed to an illegitimate Ummah. Yes. Meaning that a legitimate Ummah that follows al-Hakimiyya, the Sharia, if not, then becomes illegitimate, the Ummah. It's very, you can see where I'm getting at. Then the establishment, so it affects the establishment of the Ummah, the establishment of authority, and the direction the Ummah will follow. Because if it's based on Sharia, so it has to be a Sharia path. It cannot deviate from the Sharia and so on. Then it is closely linked to other concepts. Once you accept that premise, so you get into a whole framework of Dawla Shar'iyya, political or legitimate state, then that's based on Hakimiyya, the sovereignty of God or the Sharia. Then you immediately get obedience, consent, loyalty, and Sharia interest. Like the interest within that ummah and that state is governed, is managed based on Sharia interest and so on. And then the legitimate state is guarded, this is a very also important issue because we saw it in the definition, is guarded by rulers and scholars, al-umara wal-ulama. These are the guardians of that state. Why? Because the amirs are ashabul wilaya ala al-ummah. They have the sovereignty, the guardianship, the trusteeship over the ummah. I'm just quoting, I mean, like these are, and then the ulama are ahl al-hall wal-aqd, those who loosen and bind. So you can see the construct, and finally, this guardianship requires a functional linkage of right and power. Use of coercive force. Why? Because as we have seen, حراسة الدين تتطلب القوة. The protection of religion, as we have seen it, requires the use of force. دفع الناس إلى الصلاح, urging people to goodness, requires الشوكة, requires power. This is the construct. All right. Now, again, I'm not trying to demolish this. I'm just trying to say that this is fine for one stage, bringing things together, as I see. Like this idea of paradigm of the legitimate states make very positive contributions. One contribution, of course, it tries to develop a coherent framework. The second, a coherent framework from within, meaning that you are trying to use your own traditional heritage ideas in order to modernize, if you wish, synthesize, and come up with a modern thing. And finally, of course, it tries to promote a shared worldview. That this is the parameters, the elements of, or the features of political legitimacy within an Islamic framework. We share all this. Khalas, we understood. Like, for example, with Umair summarized a history of juridical and siyasa shar'iyya of 14th century, the traditional path, in 4 or 5 slides. خلاص خلصنا. That's it. Okay, that's what he did. So we all shared this. حراسة الدين وصلاح الدنيا and this and this. We all understand this and we share it and so on. Now, the criticism. And again, it's a criticism just to accumulate and then transcend. This paradigm, of course, raises a number of serious questions. This might be kind of metaphorical, but it does to relate to politics actually what the official scholars do to religion, which is maintain a little bit idealistic view of religion, normative view of religion, that is more or less actually isolated from reality. The reality is not like this. The theoretical framework does not fit that reality, does not describe that reality, cannot be implemented in that reality, and as you will see. Second, it assumes that identifying, this is the most important issue, identifying a paradigm, a theoretical paradigm, or a high framework of values, even religious or Islamic, that's the assumption, that it secures its acceptance by society. I think the Arab Spring onward shows us exactly the opposite. In every single country, it was 50-50. The bad guys won 50, the good guys won 50% of the votes. And in the end, as usual, the bad guys win. So this idea, the discrepancy between this ideal paradigm, because it's driven from Islamic notions, because it is divine rule, divinely inspired, does not mean anything. Doesn't mean anything. And I will show you again why. Then it gives supremacy to the state or society, over society. It gives supremacy to the state over society. 5 minutes? All right. Then it maintains also a reductionist, this is very important, a reductionist view of the ummah. This is very dangerous, by the way. When we talk about the ummah, we always refer to ummah of believers. There are more than ummah of believers within. There are labor unions, syndicates, Hollywood-like movie actors and producers that mess up the mind. There are media there are so many constituencies within the ummah. This idea of ummah, yes, we seek to make it and we seek to provide the common grounds for it. But it's not tenable now. It doesn't exist now. We have to exist with what we have. And what we have, as the Quran says, that the majority are not going to follow the good path, the righteous path. The majority are not going to do this. They will vote Sisi, and they will vote Ben Ali again, and they will vote Saddam again. So that we have to deal or consider that reality. Now, finally, there are huge radical differences between this school. Like some start with proving the legitimacy of the state or the paradigm for a legitimate state, and some actually consider the state to be extremely non-interventionist state, the Islamic state. In essence, it's non-interventionist, and they try to prove the supremacy of the ummah. So within the same school, there are diametrical differences. All right, now, I have to move very quickly because I think I have 3 minutes. Political legitimacy and our current context. In his magnum opus book, Overstating the Arab State, Nazih Ayubi highlights, this is very important, highlights the fact that the Arab states, open quote, lacks ideological hegemony in the Gramscian sense that will enable it to forge a historical social bloc, ummah, that accepts the legitimacy of the ruling stratum. When he talks, this is his definition of overstate or justification for overstating the Arab state. That is overstated. It's too weak, and it has never had this idea of imposing this idea of over the social historical bloc. What concerns me is the social historical bloc. So this statement, if we qualify it a little bit, can help me get to the conclusion. Now, 2011, in one of its manifestations, if we'd like to explain it, it really represents some kind of a clear rupture between those in power, the nation state, the authority, and anyone, and the social bloc that managed to become, or the constituencies that in 2011 managed to constitute a social bloc. The 4 million, the 18 million, whatever, the 30 million, whatever it is. But in this moment, society managed really to constitute that social bloc. And that social bloc declared its rebellion, if you wish, against those in power and so on. All right? Now, the logical conclusion after this is what? This social bloc proceeds, and declare its new legitimacy. Remove these from power and bring in a new legitimacy, democratic, revolutionary, socialist, call it whatever, Islamic, call it whatever it is. But that was the logical conclusion, that if you would like to adopt the conspiracy theory, not conspiracy theory, the fact of the matter is, did not happen. States turned in a civil war against their own civil societies. Very clear examples. Or the social bloc turned against each other, against itself, and delved into what? Its own civil wars. So the whole, in the end, this logical conclusion was not reached. I have something to say about what could have happened in the Middle East had the Arab Spring succeeded, and the whole new reconfiguration of the area, totally new area based on, even on the basis of value, and in basis of interest, and in the basis of potential, power and potential, and so on. But anyway, this is a different discussion. So instead, we see this kind of situation that we are all witnessing, either states turning into bully states against their own societies, or the historical social bloc killing each other. I was talking with Mr. Ali yesterday, and I'm telling him how are Libya doing and so on. He says, wallahi, people, like they go to mosque and then they get out, hold the Kalashnikov and kill each other. All right? So this is the social, that what happened. All right. Now, I have to skip some parts, but the important thing here also is, now, what's wrong here? What's wrong here? And I think this is very important for us to address, if not in this conference, in subsequent conferences, that this idea of a nasaq al-qiyasi paradigm is not shared anymore. What is happening is, I acknowledge that the dominant, or the basis for our dominant belief system is Islamic, religious, in the region, here in the region, and most Muslim society. Nobody can deny this. However, we failed, and I hope you get me right, because it's very dangerous if you get me wrong with this. We failed to develop this Islamic belief system into a system of, or a shared system of civic virtues. I will explain what I mean by this. Or a system of political values that can guide political behavior. What I mean, that we stopped with this belief system at the normative level. Hijab, veil, beard, then we go to the mosque, pray, 100 rak'ahs, come out and cheat. Come out and cheat, normal. It's a normative religion. We have turned it into a normative religion. As they say in Egypt, when they see veiled, with all respect, from up Amr Khalid, from bottom Amr Diab. All right, so this is what we see. I mean, this is the perception. But we did not internalize this. You see what I mean? It still stays at the ritualistic, normative level. It's not internalized. Example, how we resolve our political differences when we disagree. We don't talk to each other. We stab each other in the back. We mistrust each other. How we work collectively in an institutionalized, organized way. Difficult. But we go to the West, brilliant. We do it immediately, right? We just, streamline immediately. How we use violence, for example. Or when do we resort to violence? There are so many examples. How do we respect human rights, individual and collective human rights? Genuinely. Even the religion, again, it's another topic for discussion. We have 4 or 5, 6 universal values. Universal, irreducible, self-evident, do not even need explanation. That will urge us to respect human rights, differences, pluralism. We keep always saying, يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. And then we kill each other. We cannot tolerate a sect. We have to resolve this. We cannot keep saying verbally what we don't mean. Anyway, let me move to the خلاص. Stop. I have to conclude, and then yes, even if I don't answer during the question answer.
With the good guys, as you put it, and those with, but I think that's a pretty premature judgment in the sense that the experience lived by the people in those states where they were given the ability to express themselves. You're talking about a matter of months, and in some instances even less than that, comparative to decades worth of repression, oppression, and ignorance. And to the fact that if it was 50%, 50% is actually a very big achievement in light of the fact that they didn't have that before. And what I want to get at is this, is that when we're looking at things through that prism, yes, it's important to try and assess, because obviously you're seeing fault lines changing, and how you're going to use that in order to identify if indeed we are working towards formalizing this concept or notion of the Ummah. So you have to look at it in terms of the needs of the stakeholders of it, which is the people. But on the other hand, those people themselves don't know what it is they want, if you see what I mean. Yani, it's still an experience. You don't suddenly wake up, or you don't. Yes, there's awakenings and there are things that happen, but it doesn't happen overnight. So how do you use that experience of just a year or 2 years maximum to then formulate the expectations of how it should be in the future? If that's clear.
I'll try to be very brief so to allow everyone, again, and a larger room for questions and answers. I gave that example just to show that this idea of a shared belief system or paradigm does not necessarily that we, as you said, that we are talking or agreeing on a specific form of government or interest or expectations and so on. That's what I talked about, that it's readily accepted. If an Islamic movement comes to power, it's coming to power within today's context. Maybe not because it's Islamic, but because people's expectation of that government, when it comes to social justice, development, economic growth, equality, are placing hopes on that thing. The other thing, I fully agree with you, with one slight modification, because I cannot really let it go, that people don't know what they want. We teach rational choice. People know exactly what they want. They want stability. They hate unpredictability of the Muslim Brotherhood. Very unpredictable. They hate it.
But rather how to achieve it, not what they want. So they don't know how to achieve it rather than not knowing what they want.
Exactly, and that's why they need the enablers, that they see them qualified to achieve their interests and bring their interests. And then, as I said, this goes up and down. At one moment, change. People would like change. Obama. Yes, we can. We are the change. When people ask, where is the change? They said, him. He's the change. Look, he looks like change, all right? That's it. Yes, yes. But in essence, there's no change. So people sometimes at some moment, they want change. And some moment now in Egypt, for example, they want stability. Mm-hmm. They are afraid of the unseen, of the coming, of the alternatives. It's very simple. I don't know whether I answered this or not, but had they given more time, for example, I have no doubt that they would have been, they would have done very well. They learned from their experience governing and so on, but they were not giving the chance. I agree with you fully.
Okay. Please, colleague from up there, maybe we can get the questions right after you from here as well.
Thank you. I got a question regarding what was said, was talked about yesterday and also today a bit, and especially when we talk about the Ummah as a political project. Yesterday, one of the presenters was arguing that the Medina Treatise was actually speaking about the Muslim and the Jewish Ummah being one Ummah, and I have always read it a different way. I mean, I'm a bit on slippery grounds here because I'm, first of all, a layman, and secondly, no historian, but a political scientist. But the way I've read it, I mean, also in a literal sense, was that Jews and Muslims are a Ummah. That's what the text is saying, which implies that the notion or the Ummah here is actually much more a political one, and if I'm a bit provocative, a secular one, and not per se a religious one. And I was a bit confused about the whole discourse we had yesterday and also today, even if not explicitly. But when we speak about the Ummah, we tend always to rather see it first and foremost as a religious category, rather than seeing it as a purely political one. The reason why I'm asking this, and I want to have your opinions on that, is because I have the impression that by confining it to a religious category, we very much narrow down all the possibilities of a political project coming out of a Muslim spirituality. And I very much endorse the way Mr. Erse was talking about the issue yesterday, because he rather put it in a socio-economic, global, structural problem, which is when we talk about a political solution to a problem, we don't see it through a Muslim lens. And I want to say it again in a very provocative way. Isn't rather in a political thought much more interesting rather to look at it from a purely secular, I know the secular religious divide doesn't work this way, but rather looking at it from a purely worldly perspective in terms of a political project of the Ummah.
I have actually three remarks. The first one is it's about the whole approach for the concept of Muslim Ummah. There is I have three remarks about the whole approach for the subject of the Muslim Ummah and what is related to this concept. First of all, I have the feeling that we are treating the Muslim Ummah as a geographical area where the Muslims are living, or the areas where a previous Islamic state was there and is no longer there. I think this is against the Quran, because if we are going to talk about the Muslim Ummah, we are going to talk about the whole humanity. If the first establisher of the Muslim Ummah is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Ghar Hira, he received the message for the whole humanity. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق. So it's about humanity. It's not about the Arabs. It's not about a certain community. So there is the other remark is that we are treating the Muslim Ummah as we are treating the state. The Ummah is not the state. So we cannot talk about the problems of the Muslim Ummah in terms of states. We have to talk about the problems of the Muslim Ummah according to the humanity, the problems of humanity. And this gets us to a third remark, that our terminology, our paradigms are capitalist terminologies and paradigms. We are talking from within the social sciences, political science, sociology, or other sciences that were established by capitalism and spread all over the world, carrying the assumptions of capitalism, where economics, political science comes first, not ethical issues. If we go to the Quran, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. So the ethical is over everything. Whoever lives in the world and carries the issue, the manners of humanity, the values of humanity, is within the Muslim Ummah, regardless of the political system he's living under. Politics comes second, economics comes second, and first of all, he has to carry the ethical side of Islam. So the problem of what we call now Muslim Ummah is an ethical issue. They do not adhere to the ethics and values of Islam. Thank you.
Thank the three panelists, and I have 2 points. One is when Ovamir spoke about the traditions here, you missed a very important school, that is the Ibadi school. The Ibadi school in the Islamic literature really represents the Republican, quote-unquote, school, which does not adhere to the old traditions of Qurayshi or other things, but that the Ummah chooses its leader. I think it's missing from many of the literature because some scholars consider the Ibadis as a sprang of Khawarij, which is wrong. That's one point. I wish that you will address it in your studies in the future. For the other point is the Arab Spring, and I'm one of the people who cares for it. I think there was a premature functional operation when people were run to elections and told that 51% can make the decision. In countries under so long time oppressive and dictatorial regimes, there is now a scholarship that says there should be a method of a consensual democracy, which means all parts have to come to agreement instead of winner takes all. Otherwise, the difficulties that we have faced together could be part of it because the winner takes all, and the other side does not feel that it has a say in the affairs of the state. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Please, Dr. Ahmad.
All right. With regard to the point about the treaties and so on, the Prophet ﷺ, he made 2 types of treaties. One is citizenship treaty. This is the Covenant of Medina. Like it establishes citizenship. And I share your reading exactly. And al-Muslimuna wa kaza and this and this and this ummatan min dunin nas. They are one nation, nation state, whatever you call them, exclusively from other nation states or other people and so on. That's one type, the citizenship establishing or type. And the second type is defense or protection type, which is, for example, Nasara Bani Najran. It's a defense treaty. Establishes also rights and duties and so on, but does not establish citizenship rights. All right. So now, does that lead us immediately to look at things from a secular, worldly point of view? That's where I'm going to disagree, if you allow me. No, it leads us to look at things from an essentially, and not comprehensively, but essentially, basically, Islamic point of view. Because Islam is unique. And our understanding of Islam should be unique as well. We get to the bottom of it. Yani the other comments, for example, about the Nas and so on, that touches on the essence of the Islamic message itself. What is it? People will tell you just to worship Allah. Yes, but what is it? In essence too, Rahmatan lil Alameen. It's a mercy to mankind. Mankind, this issue of Nas and so on, period. So instead of just reproducing Islam as a religion of mercy, which the Christianity and Christians did, as Christianity is the religion of love, we actually, or they are having us reproduce as a religions of what? Terrorism and jihad and violence and qatal and so on and so forth. But that's the essence of the religion. So I would just, have some reservation about the secular thing, because we don't need it. We don't need it because it is the worldly and the hereafter as well. But it doesn't. Now, with the idea of the ethical issues, I fully agree. Sharia rests on three pillars. One is, of course, the creed, the dogma, or the creed, the beliefs, aqidah, and then al-fiqh, the understanding, and then ethics. Unfortunately, we have, without realizing, become a society of legalists, fuqaha. Imagine that's what they call America. Litigation all the time. People sue all the time. We are the same thing. The fuqaha have the upper hand in everything. Do and don't. Halal, haram, and so on and so on and so forth. Even though the three should go side and side. The final result is what? Now we have the Salafis, Ashab al-Aqidah, that they have to correct your mind, and if you tell your fellow Muslim, thank you, فَقَدْ أَشْرَكْتَ, this is polytheism, because only God should be thanked, no one else. صح? So we go into the Aqidah and the Salafi and the Wahhabi thing, or the Fuqaha, the jurist thing, halal, haram, wahiyal, and peace with Israel tomorrow, yesterday is good, or haram, today is halal, and we go into this business, and we forget altogether about the third pillar of Sharia, which is ethics. They all should go hand in hand into a not a normative, but internalized way that will reflect on our behavior. علم يتبعه عمل. علم يتبعه عمل. Knowledge that has to lead to work and action. Hand in hand. طيب, in the end, where is our responsibility? Our responsibility is shahada, witnessing. That's all what we have to do. And how do we witness, or how we stand as witnesses? By good example, good deed. It's very simple. We don't have to succeed in anything, by the way, but just to follow, the essence of what the religion asks us to do. Just set a good example, and then let the results up to Allah. I mean, that's look at the prophets. Not a single prophet promised his people that will give him anything worldly. It's always in the hereafter. As if it's self-defeating da'wah. Do this, I will guarantee paradise for you. But he never, promised them prosperity and, will be among the leading nations of the world. No prophet does this. We need to take it easy, in a nutshell.
I actually want to answer part of your question about, and challenge this idea that it's maybe secular is not the right word. And look at understanding these ethical principles that stem from our Sharia, and do they only apply to Muslims in the Muslim world or Muslim majority countries? Because what are those principles? It's upholding mercy, upholding justice. Now, I come from a land of rising tribalism, right, where there's one a shab and two shabs, right? Gender inequality, where the body politics is fighting about rights on the bodies of women until today, where 1 in 4 children live in poverty, where there is lack of potable water still throughout the country, where there is major human insecurity, where people are fired on in squares, where innocent people die in prisons, where the street moves without thinking. And I come from the United States. So where does the concept of ummah extend? And if it's those ideas of those ethical principles that come from our maqasid of Sharia, then of course it's not a secular paradigm, and it's not limited to the Muslim majority countries. It has to transcend. It has to make us rethink this project of the future of the nation state, but really the future of the world order. And it takes me to the questions on voting and the elections and what do they represent. In part of my talk, and I know I went through it very quickly, I really want to challenge this idea of Arab exceptionalism or Muslim world exceptionalism, and think about these, post-revolutionary elections. What do they really reflect? Is it in-group, out-group dynamic, or is it instability and insecurity? What do we learn from the experiments of Latin America or Poland after the Solidarity movement? These were all places where, right after revolutions, people had to, shave their beard, take a shower, and go into politics, and failed to actually come up with an interesting discourse on where stability is going to come from based on the revolutions they just went through. And so I really want to challenge the idea that this is secular versus religious or limited to Muslim majority countries if we're really going to take, as was discussed last night, this ummah approach of understanding the world that transcends, time and space, but really community.
May I? Please. Bismillah, alhamdulillah. So a lot of claims and passionate calls have been made. So let me back up and beseech you all, one more call, that I actually don't think that the job of academics is to solve problems, to bring peace, to bring justice. But first and foremost, the job of ulama, of academics, whether they are, and there is no fundamental difference, is to actually learn the truth, al-haq. And I think that so much of what I've heard here is not interested in disciplined knowledge. It's interested only in solving problems. It's a very presentist mindset. Everything here and now. So solve the problem of Arab Spring for me, or solve the problem of the coming economic crisis for me. And that is not what I'm specialized to do. That is not what academics do. I can talk about it, but I would not know anything about it. So let me just beg you to respect al-haq, knowledge, for what it is. And it can do something very humble, very little, not too much, but it matters a lot. So it may be that we don't know what Arab Spring was about until we figure out a disciplined and shared language to talk about it across the various pretenders. And at least my presentation was not an endorsement of the particular, any of these many particular models, but rather for respect for disciplined study of things. That's all. I'm not asking you to solve any problems, but just respect al-haq, because one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-haq. And one of the dearest things for me to think about what is it that I do. I worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by His name al-haq, even if that makes me unpopular. And so every understanding that I find in the Muslim world is geared toward result. Everything is result oriented. You want to understand Mithaq Medina, the Pact of Medina, for example. It has to become the first model of citizenship and the first constitution and solution to all problems in the world, because you can't actually study the text. You already have decided that this is superior to everything else, even if you haven't read it, because nobody's actually interested in disciplined knowledge, a shared language by which we can critique each other and grow in knowledge so we can agree on something before disagreeing, right? So when you don't have that shared knowledge, when you don't have respect for al-haq, when you don't have respect for discipline, everything becomes a shouting match. And I think that at university and a conference, this is one of the things, one of the blocks of perhaps a small achievement that we can have is just care about the truth, even if it goes against what is popular, against my own interest.
Thank you very much for our panelists, and thank you for coming to this panel. Now we can conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really a very good and rich session. It's going to be a very tough act to follow. We have a few awards. Presents. Professor Emad, Shahin. Dr. Dalia Fahmy. Dr. Anjum. And Dr. Telci. Okay, we're going to have a break, and we should be back in about 20 minutes. We're going to start promptly at 11:55. Thank you.